The shipyard in Mobile, Alabama is loud with the sound of cutting torches and grinding metal. It is August 2025, and workers in hard hats and safety vests are dismantling something that should never have come to this. They're not scrapping some rusting freighter or forgotten barge. They're stripping the fastest ocean liner ever built piece by piece, preparing her for a fate her designer never could have imagined. The first funnel came down earlier this week, 65 feet tall, painted in the red, white, and blue that once made her instantly recognizable on the North Atlantic. It now lies on the dock like a severed limb. The second funnel followed within hours, along with the radar mast that once guided her across 3,000 miles of open ocean at speeds no passenger ship had ever achieved. The propeller, 18 feet of manganese bronze weighing over 60,000 pounds, has been unbolted and set aside, destined for a museum that will try to explain what this ship once meant to a nation. 80% of the remediation work is complete. The asbestos is being removed, the wiring stripped, the glass and plastic and fuel extracted so that what remains will be environmentally safe for its final destination, the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, 22 miles off the coast of Destin, Florida. There, in 180 feet of water, the SS United States will become the world's largest artificial reef. It is, depending on your perspective, either a fitting tribute to an American icon or the final indignity for a ship that was never supposed to sink. Because here's the thing about the SS United States. She was designed to be unsinkable, not in the naive, arrogant way the Titanic's builders once claimed. William Francis Gibbs, the man who spent 40 years of his life bringing this ship into existence, studied every maritime disaster of the 20th century. He built redundant engine rooms so that damage to one wouldn't cripple the ship. He compartmentalized her hull so that flooding in any section could be contained. He made her fireproof, truly, obsessively fireproof, because he had watched what fire could do to a ship full of sleeping passengers. And now she's being deliberately sunk. The fastest ship ever built is being prepared to disappear forever beneath the warm waters of the Florida Panhandle. How did we get here? To understand the SS United States, you first have to understand the man who created her, because William Francis Gibbs didn't just design this ship, he willed her into existence across 4 decades of setbacks, wars, and his own demons. Gibbs was born on August 24, 1886 in Philadelphia, the son of a financier whose skill at accumulating million-dollar fortunes was matched only by his ability to squander them. The family would be rich one year and on the verge of ruin the next, a roller coaster of boom and bust that taught young William early that nothing in life was guaranteed. His father was dogmatic and demanding, expecting his sons to pursue respectable professions that would restore the family's name. But when William was 8 years old, something happened that would determine the course of his entire life. His father took him to the cramped shipyard in Philadelphia to watch the launch of the SS St. Louis, an ocean liner sliding down the ways and into the Delaware River. The boy stood there mesmerized as the massive hull dropped into the water, the spray rising, the crowd cheering, the industrial power of late 19th century America on full display. He would later say that from that day forward, he dedicated his life to ships. The problem was that William Francis Gibbs had no apparent talent for the work that ships required. He was shy and sickly, terrified of simple mathematics, and possessed of none of the natural engineering instincts that might have made his path easier. He enrolled at Harvard's Lawrence Scientific School in 1906, determined to study engineering despite his father's objections. Most of the engineers his father knew, after all, were pretty impractical people. Harvard was not a success. Gibbs was an introverted prep school Protestant living in a Gold Coast dormitory, but no final club wanted him. His grades were abysmal, and he withdrew before completing his sophomore year. He traveled to Europe with his younger brother Frederick, sailing on Cunard's revolutionary new liners Lusitania and Mauretania, studying their engines and their hulls and their passenger accommodations with an intensity that bordered on obsession. When he returned to Cambridge, he switched from engineering to economics, excelled briefly, then left again when his father's latest financial disaster forced him to find work. He ended up at Columbia Law School, not because he wanted to practice law, but because he needed a credential. He graduated in 1913 and took a job as a real estate lawyer in Philadelphia, settling into the worthwhile life his father had always expected of him. But every night, after his work was done, Gibbs studied something else entirely. He read naval architecture journals in secret. He sketched ship designs on weekends. He taught himself the physics of hull resistance and propulsion systems from borrowed textbooks, because that's the way to really learn things, by yourself. His younger brother Frederick, who had followed him into business, became his co-conspirator. Together, in the evenings and on weekends, they designed imaginary ships, massive ocean liners that existed only on paper. In 1915, at the age of 29, Gibbs made a decision that seemed insane to everyone who knew him. He quit his law practice and approached Admiral David W. Taylor, the leading naval architect in the United States Navy, with a portfolio of ship designs. Taylor, impressed despite himself, took Gibbs on as an apprentice. It was the beginning of a career that would change maritime history. But first, there would be setbacks. The designs that Gibbs and his brother Frederick had been working on in secret were not modest proposals. They envisioned two massive superliners, each over 1,000 feet long, powered by 180,000 horsepower engines that would make them the fastest ships in the world. When J.P. Morgan Jr., Supremo of the International Mercantile Marine, which controlled virtually all transatlantic shipping, saw the plans, he was so impressed that he offered to finance their construction. Then World War I intervened. The Morgan deal collapsed. The brothers' grand vision was shelved indefinitely. But Gibbs, characteristically, refused to give up. When the German superliner Vaterland was seized as a war prize and needed to be converted into an American troop ship, Gibbs volunteered to oversee the project. His final report ran 1,024 pages, and buried within it was a clause, sneakily inserted, that granted him full oversight of all work on the vessel. The renamed USS Leviathan was completed to Gibbs's exacting standards, and he had proven for the first time that he could deliver results at scale. In 1922, he and Frederick founded Gibbs Brothers, Inc., which would later become Gibbs & Cox when they brought in partner Daniel H. Cox. The firm designed dozens of ships throughout the 1920s and 1930s. The Matson lines, SS Malolo, the Grace Line vessels, the SS America for United States Lines. But none of these were anything close to the record breaker Gibbs had dreamed of since childhood. Then, in 1934, something happened that would shape everything that followed. The SS Morro Castle was a cruise ship operating between New York and Havana when, in the early morning hours of September 8th, fire broke out in a storage locker. The ship's captain had died of a heart attack the night before. The acting captain, William Worms, was unprepared for the crisis that unfolded. The fire spread with terrifying speed through the ship's wooden interiors and flammable furnishings. Passengers awoke to smoke and flames. Lifeboats were lowered half empty, while others couldn't be launched at all. Bodies washed ashore on the New Jersey coast for days afterward. 137 people died. William Francis Gibbs, already meticulous by nature, became something close to monomaniacal about fire safety after Morro Castle. He would later say that the disaster haunted him. He studied every aspect of how the fire had spread, why the ship's systems had failed, how the design of its interiors had transformed a manageable emergency into a catastrophe. And he swore that any ship he built would be different. The fireproofing obsession would become legendary. But first, there was another war to win. When World War II began, Gibbs and Cox was positioned to become one of the most important contractors in American history. The firm had already designed the revolutionary Mahan-class destroyers, the first combat vessels to use high-pressure, high-temperature steam turbines, and their speed and maneuverability would prove essential to victory in the Pacific. But the scale of what Gibbs accomplished between 1941 and 1945 defies easy comprehension. The firm designed 70% of all U.S. Navy ships built during the war. The destroyers that hunted German U-boats across the Atlantic, the escort carriers that provided air cover for convoys, the landing craft that deposited Allied troops on the beaches of Normandy, and, most critically, the Liberty ships, the mass-produced cargo vessels that carried food, weapons, and supplies to Europe faster than the enemy could sink them. The Liberty ships were an engineering revolution disguised as a crude, ugly workhorse. Gibbs figured out how to design them so they could be built by workers with minimal training, using prefabricated sections that could be assembled in a matter of weeks rather than months. At the peak of production, American shipyards were launching a new Liberty ship every 8 hours. The German Navy simply couldn't keep pace. By the time the war ended, Gibbs and Cox had designed or overseen the construction of vessels representing 63% of all merchant ships over 2,000 tons and 74% of all Navy vessels. William Francis Gibbs, the Harvard dropout who had taught himself naval architecture from library books, had done more than perhaps any other civilian to ensure Allied victory. And now, at last, he could build the ship he had been dreaming about for 40 years. The SS United States was never purely a commercial venture. From the beginning, she was designed with one eye on peacetime luxury and one eye on the next war. The U.S. government had learned hard lessons during World War II about the value of fast ocean liners. The British Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth had been pressed into service as troop ships, their speed allowing them to outrun German submarines and transport thousands of soldiers across the Atlantic without convoy escort. The Queens had moved over 1 million American troops to the European theater. Winston Churchill himself would later say that their contribution shortened the war by a full year. The United States, by contrast, had possessed no comparable vessels. American troops had to be moved on slower ships in vulnerable convoys or crammed aboard the borrowed British liners. It was a humiliation for a nation that considered itself the world's leading industrial power, and military planners were determined that it would never happen again. When Gibbs approached the government with his proposal for an American superliner, the Cold War was just beginning. Korea was descending into conflict. The Soviet Union had tested its first atomic bomb. The prospect of another global war, this time with the need to rapidly deploy troops to multiple theaters simultaneously, made the Navy intensely interested in what Gibbs was proposing. The SS United States would be designed from the keel up to serve as a military asset. Her top speed would be classified, because no enemy could be allowed to know exactly how fast she could move. Her engines would be capable of propelling her at over 40 knots, fast enough to outrun any warship or submarine of the era. She would carry enough fuel to travel 10,000 miles without refueling, and her interiors could be stripped and reconfigured to transport 14,000 troops in a matter of days. The government agreed to pay roughly 1/3 of the $77.7 million construction cost through what was called a construction differential subsidy, $18.6 million to cover the difference between building an ordinary liner and building a ship that could fight a war. The Navy would have input on every aspect of her design, and certain specifications would remain classified for over a decade. The SS United States would be America's flagship in every sense of the word. She just had to be built first. The keel was laid on February 8, 1950, at the Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company in Virginia. It was the beginning of one of the most intensive engineering projects in maritime history. Gibbs had decided to build the ship in a dry dock rather than on a traditional slipway, partly to simplify construction, but mostly to maintain secrecy about her underwater configuration. The dry dock allowed workers to build her from the ground up without anyone seeing her hull design, her propeller arrangement, or the shape of her below waterline sections. By the time she was floated out, she would be nearly complete. The scale of the project was staggering. The ship would be 90 feet long, just under the 1,000-foot limit for transiting the Panama Canal, with a beam of 101.5 feet. She would displace 47,100 tons and carry nearly 2,000 passengers in 3 classes. Her construction would require 183,000 separately fabricated steel sections, 1.2 million aluminum rivets, and 1,500 miles of weld metal. But it was the aluminum that made her revolutionary. Gibbs had calculated that by building the superstructure, everything above the waterline, out of aluminum rather than steel, he could reduce the ship's weight by thousands of tons. That weight savings would translate directly into speed. The SS United States would use 2,000 tons of aluminum in her construction, the largest concentration of the material in any structure until the World Trade Center went up in the 1970s. Her dead weight would be just 45,400 long tons, compared to 77,000 for the similarly sized Cunard Queens. And then there was the fireproofing. William Francis Gibbs, still haunted by the Morro Castle disaster, had decreed that there would be no wood anywhere on the ship. None, not in the walls, not in the furniture, not in the decorations. Every surface, every fixture, every piece of trim would be made from non-combustible materials: aluminum, glass, steel, spun glass fiber. There was exactly one exception, and it required a battle. Theodore Steinway, head of the legendary piano company, refused to build an aluminum piano for the ship's music lounge. Pianos, he insisted, required wooden soundboards to produce proper tone. An aluminum piano would sound like a tin can. Gibbs was unmoved until Steinway demonstrated that a mahogany piano, soaked in fire-resistant chemicals and properly treated, would not burn even when doused with gasoline and set ablaze. The piano was allowed aboard. It and the butcher's block in the galley would be the only pieces of wood on the entire ship. Everything else was fireproof. Mock-up cabins were constructed and torched at the National Bureau of Standards to ensure that no hidden combustible material had been included by mistake. The aluminum clothes hangers in the luxury cabins, the lacquered furniture, the interior walls. If it could burn, it wasn't allowed on the SS United States. The interiors were the work of an all-female design firm called Smith, Urquhart, and Markwald, led by Dorothy Markwald and Anne Urquhart. It was a remarkable choice for the era, a trio of women given complete creative control over the most ambitious American ocean liner ever built. They were tasked with creating 26 public rooms, 674 staterooms, and 20 luxury suites that would showcase mid-century American modernism while adhering to Gibbs's uncompromising safety requirements. It was not an easy balance to strike. Every fabric had to be flame retardant. Every piece of furniture had to be built from non-combustible materials: glass, aluminum, steel, spun glass fiber that looked like silk but wouldn't burn. And yet the ship had to feel luxurious, inviting, worth the premium fares that first-class passengers would pay for a transatlantic crossing. The Smythe, Urquhart, and Markwald team had to invent solutions that didn't exist, working with manufacturers to create fireproof versions of materials that had never been made fireproof before. The designers succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, creating a floating showcase of American artistry that rivaled anything on the French or British liners. The first-class dining room was the ship's crown jewel, a two-deck high space that could seat hundreds of passengers in a single sitting. Its centerpiece was Expressions of Freedom, a sculptural installation by artist Gwen Lux depicting the four freedoms that Roosevelt had articulated during the war: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear. The figures seemed to float above the diners, a constant reminder that this ship represented something larger than mere transportation. The walls were clad in non-combustible panels in soft grays and beiges. The carpeting, specially treated to resist fire, featured geometric patterns in muted tones. The tables were set with custom-made aluminum flatware that gleamed like silver, and the windows, spanning nearly the full height of the room, offered views of the Atlantic that no dining room on land could match. The observation lounge, located high in the superstructure with panoramic views forward, showcased hand-woven draperies by textile artist Dorothy Liebes, vast expanses of fireproof fabric in warm earth tones that caught the changing light of the sea. The walls featured murals depicting ocean currents and constellations so that passengers could trace their journey across both water and sky. Deep, comfortable seating arrangements encouraged conversation, while a bar at one end served cocktails until the early morning hours. The cabin class lounge, one deck below, featured Hildreth Mayer's magnificent Mississippi mural, a celebration of the great American river system that provided a counterpoint to the ocean voyage itself. Mayer had worked with the firm before, on the SS America in 1939, and her work here was considered among her finest maritime commissions. Even the theater was extraordinary. Seating several hundred passengers across all classes, it featured first-run films and live entertainment. Its stage curtain, another Dorothy Liebes creation, was described as mysterious dark blue with black, decorated with colorful pom-poms that caught the light as the curtains opened and closed. The aluminum seats were upholstered in fire-resistant fabric that managed to feel luxurious despite its industrial origins. There were smoking rooms and card rooms, libraries and writing rooms, a gymnasium with the latest exercise equipment, a swimming pool that managed to feel glamorous despite being built entirely of non-combustible materials. There was a children's playroom and a kennel for passengers traveling with dogs. There was a hospital equipped to handle everything from seasickness to surgical emergencies. The staterooms themselves ranged from compact tourist-class cabins, functional but comfortable with bunk beds and minimal storage, to sprawling first-class suites that rivaled the finest hotel accommodations in New York or Paris. The 20 luxury suites featured sitting rooms, private bathrooms with full bathtubs, and enough space to entertain guests. The aluminum furniture was lacquered in colors chosen by the designers. The built-in closets featured aluminum hangers. Gibbs had insisted, even here. The class divisions, traditional for ocean liners of the era, were strictly maintained. First-class passengers, who paid $350 for a one-way ticket, equivalent to over $4,000 today, had access to the most elegant public rooms, the finest dining, the most spacious cabins. They boarded through separate gangways, dined at separate sittings, and relaxed in separate lounges. Cabin class passengers paid $220 and occupied the middle tier with comfortable but less lavish accommodations. Tourist class passengers at $165 were housed in smaller cabins on the lower decks, their public rooms simpler but still well appointed by the standards of the day. Gibbs had envisioned that passengers would enforce the separation themselves, intermingling only in certain shared spaces: the gymnasium, the swimming pool, the theater. It was an idea associated with the old world, this physical stratification by wealth and status, and it sat somewhat awkwardly with the otherwise patriotic American theming of the ship. But ocean liner tradition was powerful, and the class system remained intact throughout the ship's operating life. At maximum capacity, the ship could carry 894 first-class passengers, 524 in cabin class, and 554 in tourist class, nearly 2,000 people in all. Serving them required a crew of over 1,000, stewards and waiters, cooks and bakers, engineers and deck officers, musicians and beauticians. The ratio was remarkable, roughly one crew member for every 2 passengers, ensuring a level of personal service that no airline could match. On July 3, 1952, the SS United States left New York Harbor on her maiden voyage to Southampton. The scene at Pier 86 was unlike anything the waterfront had witnessed in years. Over 70,000 people had toured the ship in the days before departure, waiting in lines that stretched 14 blocks from the pier. They came to see what American ingenuity had built, to walk the same decks that celebrities would walk, to sit in the same lounges where deals would be struck and romances would bloom, to glimpse the future of transatlantic travel. Newsreel cameras captured the crowds, the ship, the moment when America's flagship would finally prove herself on the open water. Margaret Truman, the president's daughter, was among the passengers, lending the voyage an air of official significance. The ship's captain, Commodore Harry Manning, was a seasoned veteran who had commanded the SS America and understood exactly what was expected of him. The provisions loaded aboard included 7,935 quarts of ice cream, 500 pounds of caviar, enough champagne to supply a small country, and the anxious hopes of everyone who had invested in the ship's success. At noon, the whistles sounded. The tugboats maneuvered the great ship away from the pier, and the SS United States headed for open water to prove what her designer had always believed she could do. What happened over the next 3.5 days would become the stuff of maritime legend. William Francis Gibbs had given the crew specific instructions: don't beat the record by very much. He wanted to save the ship's full capabilities for future crossings, for situations where an extra burst of speed might be needed. He also knew that the current record, held by the RMS Queen Mary for 14 years, was 3 days, 20 hours, and 42 minutes eastbound. Beating it by too large a margin might raise uncomfortable questions about just how fast the SS United States could really go. The Navy had classified her top speed for a reason, but the crew couldn't help themselves. The ship was performing beyond even the most optimistic projections. Her 4 propellers, 18 feet of manganese bronze each, the forward pair with 4 blades, the aft pair with 5, bit into the Atlantic with enormous force. Her 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers, generating steam at 1,000 pounds per square inch and 975 degrees Fahrenheit, drove the 4 Westinghouse double reduction geared turbines that powered her forward. The vibration was subtle but constant, a gentle thrum that passengers could feel in their staterooms, in the dining room, in every corner of the ship. She knifed through the North Atlantic so fast that paint began shearing off her hull from the friction of the water. Her bow wave was enormous, the wake stretching for miles behind her. Officers on the bridge watched the speed indicators climb past 30 knots, past 32, past 34. They were in uncharted territory for any civilian vessel. On July 7th, she arrived at Southampton, having crossed in 3 days, 10 hours and 40 minutes, averaging 35.59 knots, or nearly 41 miles per hour. She had broken the Queen Mary's record by over 10 hours. The crowds waiting at the dock knew what they were witnessing: the changing of the guard, the moment when American engineering had definitively surpassed British. On the return voyage, she broke the westbound record as well, arriving in New York in 3 days, 12 hours, and 12 minutes at an average of 34.51 knots. The SS United States had won the Blue Riband, the unofficial prize for the fastest Atlantic crossing, in both directions. She was the first American ship to hold the record in 100 years, since the SS Baltic in 1852. The newspapers called her the Superliner and the Atlantic Greyhound and America's flagship. Ticker tape parades were proposed. William Francis Gibbs, the man who had spent 40 years dreaming of this moment, permitted himself a rare public smile. And her record stands to this day, 73 years later. No passenger liner has ever crossed faster. What the public didn't know, what wouldn't be revealed until the late 1960s when the Navy finally declassified the specifications, was that she had barely been trying. Her true top speed during trials had been 38.32 knots, possibly higher. Her engines could generate 240,000 shaft horsepower, compared to 160,000 for the SS France, widely considered the second fastest liner ever built. She had crossed the Atlantic using roughly 2/3 of her available power. If the SS United States had ever been called into military service, if she had ever needed to outrun a submarine or a pursuing warship, she had reserves that no one outside the Navy knew existed. She could have gone faster, much faster, but Gibbs's instructions held. Don't beat the record by very much. Save something for when you really need it. And so, the SS United States claimed her crown with power to spare. Her true capabilities a secret shared only by the men who had built her and the admirals who might someday call upon them. For 17 years, the SS United States was the ship everyone wanted to sail. She became the preferred vessel for the wealthy, the famous, and the powerful, a floating symbol of American prestige during the height of the Cold War. To sail on her was to make a statement about who you were and what you valued. Speed, elegance, America. The passenger manifests read like a who's who of mid-century celebrity. Marilyn Monroe sailed on her, escaping the pressures of Hollywood for the anonymity of the Atlantic, though there was no real anonymity for Marilyn Monroe, even at sea. Judy Garland crossed on the ship during one of her many trips to Europe. Cary Grant, the epitome of mid-century elegance, found the first-class accommodations suitably refined. Salvador Dali brought his surrealist sensibility aboard, reportedly declaring the ship itself a work of art. Duke Ellington played the ship's piano, the famous Steinway that Theodore Steinway had refused to build in aluminum. Walt Disney traveled back and forth to Europe as his empire expanded, planning theme parks in the comfort of his stateroom. Marlon Brando, method acting even in transit, reportedly spent entire voyages in character preparation. Grace Kelly crossed on the ship with her new husband, Prince Rainier of Monaco, the fairy tale marriage of an American movie star and European royalty symbolized by their choice to travel on America's flagship. Greta Garbo, famous for her reclusiveness, found the first-class accommodations sufficiently private. She could dine in her suite, avoid the common areas, and still cross the Atlantic in record time. Joan Crawford sailed multiple times, her luggage reportedly filling entire holds. Alfred Steele, the Pepsi executive who became her husband, accompanied her on business trips that mixed Hollywood glamour with corporate deal-making. Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Ethiopia, chose the SS United States when dignity and speed were equally important. 4 American presidents traveled on the ship, though not all while serving in office. Harry Truman crossed during his retirement, enjoying the celebrity status that former presidents commanded. Dwight Eisenhower sailed during his military career, Before the presidency that would define the 1950s, John F. Kennedy and his wife Jacqueline sailed from Southampton in 1955 when he was still a young senator from Massachusetts, handsome, charismatic, and already being mentioned as a future president. The passenger manifest from that crossing became historically significant only later, when the couple in stateroom B-42 moved into the White House. And in 1968, a Rhodes Scholar named Bill Clinton booked passage to England. He was 22 years old, on his way to Oxford, traveling tourist class because that's what a middle-class kid from Arkansas could afford. 34 years later, he would be President of the United States, and historians would note that he was among the last Americans to cross the Atlantic on the Great Ship. The ship made over 800 transatlantic crossings, 400 round trips, carrying more than 1 million passengers and traveling over 2.7 million miles. Each crossing was a social event, a contained world of dinners and cocktail parties and chance encounters. Romances began on the SS United States. Business deals were struck. Friendships formed among strangers who might never have met on land. Her galleys operated around the clock, producing 9,000 meals per day at the height of service. The menus featured continental cuisine prepared by French-trained chefs, filet mignon and lobster thermidor, fresh baked bread, and elaborate pastries. The wine cellars carried vintages from Bordeaux and Burgundy. The provisions loaded for each voyage included thousands of quarts of ice cream, hundreds of pounds of caviar, enough champagne to float a lifeboat. Her crew of 1,000 and a crony. 50 included 760 stewards under Chief Steward Herman Muller. Their sole purpose to ensure that passengers experienced the finest service on the Atlantic. They learned passengers' names and preferences. They remembered how each traveler took their coffee, which table they preferred in the dining room, whether they liked their stateroom warm or cool. The service was personal in a way that modern travel has forgotten. She appeared in films, her sleek profile and elegant interiors providing the perfect backdrop for Hollywood storytelling. Disney used her as a setting for his 1962 family comedy Bon Voyage, sending Fred MacMurray and the family on a European adventure that began with the excitement of boarding America's greatest ship. She was featured in Gentlemen Marry Brunettes and Munster Go Home, her image recognizable to audiences who had never set foot on her decks, but knew exactly what she represented. She was, in every way that mattered, America's flagship. And then the jets came. The first commercial jet to cross the Atlantic, a British Overseas Airways Corporation, de Havilland Comet, made the journey from London to New York in 1958. The flight took roughly 8 hours. The SS United States, even at her extraordinary speeds, required more than 3 days. For passengers who valued the experience of the crossing, the elegant dinners, the entertainment, the social rituals of shipboard life, the gentle rhythm of days at sea, the ocean liner remained attractive. There was something irreplaceable about watching the horizon from the observation lounge, about dressing for dinner and descending the grand staircase, about the feeling of traveling rather than merely being transported. Some passengers would always prefer the ship, but they were increasingly in the minority. For business travelers who needed to be in London or Paris as quickly as possible, for tourists who saw the ocean crossing as wasted vacation time, for families who couldn't afford 5 extra days away from work and school, the calculus had changed forever. Why spend 3 days at sea when you could spend 8 hours in the sky? The Boeing 707 entered commercial service the same year, offering speed and convenience that no ocean liner could match. Within a decade, transatlantic passenger shipping would be essentially extinct, replaced by jets so completely that an entire industry simply vanished. United States lines tried to adapt. They launched the Unrushables marketing campaign in the 1960s, positioning the ship as a leisurely escape for passengers who weren't in a hurry. Getting there is half the fun, the advertisements promised. The ship was repositioned not as transportation, but as a floating resort, a chance to unplug from the pressures of modern life before modern life had even invented smartphones and email. They proposed a $15 million refit that would have modernized the vessel for cruise service rather than point-to-point crossings, sailing to the Caribbean in winter, the Mediterranean in summer, offering the kind of destination-based vacation that cruise lines would perfect in later decades. But the numbers simply didn't work. The ship was too big, too fast, too expensive to operate for the cruise market as it then existed. Her engines consumed fuel at a rate designed for speed, not economy. Her crew was trained for transatlantic crossings, not Caribbean itineraries. The decline came in stages, each one more painful than the last. In October 1958, a labor strike by the masters, mates, and pilots union forced the cancellation of an eastbound crossing, the first sign that even the mightiest ship couldn't sail without her crew's cooperation. The strike was resolved, but it revealed the fragility of the entire enterprise. In September 1960, the ship lost a lucrative contract to transport military dependents to Europe. The families of servicemen stationed overseas had been a reliable source of revenue, filling tourist-class cabins on voyage after voyage. When the military switched to charter flights, an entire market segment vanished overnight. By 1961, entire voyages were being canceled due to low bookings. One sailing attracted only 350 ticket purchases, fewer passengers than crew members. The great dining rooms sat half empty. The observation lounge, designed for hundreds, accommodated dozens. The economics of running a ship that size with that few passengers were devastating. United States lines cut corners where they could. Crew numbers were reduced. Maintenance was deferred. The ship that had once represented the pinnacle of American shipbuilding began to show signs of age and neglect. Passengers who had sailed on her in the glory days noticed the difference. The service wasn't quite as attentive. The meals weren't quite as elaborate. The whole experience had lost some of its magic. By 1969, the ship was losing $4.8 million annually, despite receiving $12 million in government operating subsidies. The math was brutal. Even with taxpayers covering more than half the cost, the SS United States was hemorrhaging money. When the subsidy was not renewed later that year, United States Lines had no choice but to take the vessel out of service. On November 7, 1969, the SS United States made her final arrival at Pier 86 in New York. The passengers who disembarked that day didn't know they were the last. The crew who secured the lines didn't know they were performing their duties for the final time. The whistles that sounded as she docked didn't know they were playing taps for an era. A few days later, she sailed to Newport News for what was supposed to be a routine annual overhaul. The work had barely begun when word came down to stop. The paint job was left incomplete, brushstrokes still visible where workers had abandoned their tools mid-task. The engines were cold. The ship was sealed up and laid aside, pending a decision about her future. Chief Quartermaster Leslie Barton rang. Finished with engines for the last time. The telegraph handle moved to its final position. The ship that had once crossed the Atlantic faster than any other fell silent. The engines never operated under power again. What followed was a 50-year odyssey of failed resurrections, abandoned plans, and slow deterioration. The SS United States would become a ghost ship, haunting the waterfronts of America, always on the verge of a comeback that never quite materialized. From 1969 to 1978, the ship remained hermetically sealed at Newport News, the Navy hoping she might still be called into service for some future conflict. The Cold War was far from over. The threat of conventional warfare hadn't disappeared just because nuclear weapons existed, and the admirals remembered what fast liners had done in the Second World War. There might yet be a need for a ship that could move 14,000 troops across an ocean in 3 days. But by 1978, the world had changed. Military strategy had evolved. The ship's propulsion system, revolutionary in 1952, was now considered obsolete by Navy standards. More importantly, the expense of maintaining a reserve vessel that had no realistic mission was increasingly difficult to justify. The SS United States was declared surplus and listed for sale, and so began the parade of would-be saviors. In 1980, a Seattle developer named Richard Hadley purchased the ship for $7 million with grand plans to convert her into floating condominiums. The concept had a certain appeal: permanent residences aboard a famous ocean liner, combining the romance of the sea with the stability of a fixed address. Hadley's architects drew up plans. His marketing team prepared brochures. His financing collapsed. The condos were never built. The ship sat. In 1983, the Navy itself returned with a proposal: convert the SS United States into a hospital ship, USNS United States, with 1,600 beds and 23 operating theaters. In an era of Cold War anxiety about mass casualties, a mobile hospital that could sail anywhere in the world and treat tens of thousands of wounded soldiers had strategic value. Studies were commissioned, plans were drawn, and then the project was deemed too expensive, too complicated, too impractical compared to newer alternatives. The ship sat. In October 1984, an auction was held aboard in Norfolk, Virginia. 3,000 bidders descended on the vessel like vultures, picking over the furnishings that remained from the glory days. The artwork that had once graced the public rooms, the fixtures from the staterooms, the china and silver and glassware that had served 1 million passengers, the custom-made aluminum furniture that Smith, Urquhart, and Markwald had designed. All of it was sold off piece by piece for a total of $1.65 million. Dear, what remained was a shell. The elegant interiors were gone. The personal touches that had made the ship special had been scattered to collectors and antique dealers across the country. The SS United States was now just a hull, an engineering marvel stripped of everything that had made her a home at sea. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, she was towed from port to port, each new owner full of grand plans that never materialized. A hotel in New York, a casino in Philadelphia, an attraction in some port that might appreciate her history. None of it happened. She ended up at a CSX coal pier in Newport News, surrounded by mountains of black dust, the fastest ocean liner ever built, sitting amid coal barges like a queen among paupers. In 1992, she was purchased at a U.S. Maritime Administration auction by a Turkish businessman named Karaman Sadıkoğlu through his company, Marmara Marine Inc. There was speculation that she would be towed to Turkey for scrapping. There was hope that she might be converted into something useful. Neither happened immediately. In 1996, Sadıkoğlu had her towed to Philadelphia to Pier 82 on the Delaware River. The move itself was a spectacle. The great ship, nearly 1,000 feet long, navigating channels and bridges she had never been designed to traverse. And there she stayed. For 29 years, Philadelphians grew accustomed to seeing her rusting hulk at the pier, her faded red, white, and blue funnels visible from the nearby IKEA parking lot, from the Walt Whitman Bridge, from the waterfront parks that had sprouted up around her. She became a landmark of a peculiar sort, not celebrated exactly, but acknowledged, present, waiting for something that never seemed to come. In 2009, as the ship rusted and deteriorated at her Philadelphia pier, a nonprofit organization stepped in to prevent what seemed increasingly inevitable. the sale of the SS United States to a scrapyard in India or Bangladesh, where she would be cut apart by workers in flip-flops, her steel melted down, her legacy erased. The SS United States Conservancy was led by Susan Gibbs, granddaughter of William Francis Gibbs himself. She had grown up hearing stories about her grandfather's ship, about his 40-year quest to build the fastest liner in the world, about the triumphant maiden voyage and the blue ribbon and the years of glory. She remembered family dinners where the ship was discussed with reverence, where her grandfather's obsession with fireproofing and his battles with the Navy and his insistence on perfection were recounted like sacred texts. Now she found herself fighting to keep the vessel from being dismembered. "I see this ship as a feminist icon," she would later say. She's tough and strong and resilient and holds so much." The Conservancy purchased the ship in 2011 with major financial support from media mogul Jerry Lenfest, a Philadelphia philanthropist who understood that some things were worth preserving, even when the economics didn't quite work out. The purchase saved the ship from immediate destruction, but it didn't solve the fundamental problem. What do you do with a 990-foot ocean liner that can't sail? For the next 13 years, the Conservancy tried everything they could think of to give the SS United States a second life. There were plans to convert her into a hotel, anchored permanently at some waterfront location, where guests could experience the romance of ocean liner travel without actually going anywhere. The economics were studied, the architecture was sketched, the locations were scouted. Nothing worked. There were plans for a casino, trading on the ship's glamour and history to attract gamblers who might appreciate losing money in an elegant setting. Gaming regulations complicated matters. The plan was shelved. There were proposals for mixed-use development, apartments, retail space, restaurants, museums, the kind of adaptive reuse that had worked for industrial buildings and old hotels and even a few other ships. But the SS United States was too big, too complicated, too expensive to remediate. The asbestos alone would cost tens of millions to remove. In 2016, Crystal Cruises announced a partnership to restore the ship to seagoing condition. It seemed like a miracle, a cruise line with deep pockets willing to invest in returning America's flagship to the water. A $350,000 donation was made. Celebrations were held. Press releases were issued. And then in August of that year, the plan was abandoned. Crystal cited technical and commercial challenges, which was corporate speak for, "We looked at the numbers and they didn't add up." In 2018, the Conservancy consulted with Casper Van Horen, who had successfully converted the former Holland America liner SS Rotterdam into a hotel and mixed-use development in the Netherlands. Van Horen knew what it took to bring an old liner back to life. He also knew that the SS United States would be exponentially more difficult than the Rotterdam had been. The conversation was enlightening, but didn't produce a viable plan. The following year, they announced an agreement with commercial real estate firm RXR Realty to explore options for redevelopment. RXR had experience with large, complicated projects. They had resources, they had expertise, and after studying the ship extensively, they too concluded that the numbers simply didn't work. None of it came to fruition. The fundamental problem was economics, cold and brutal. The ship needed at least $3 million per year just for basic maintenance. The pumps that kept water out of her hull, the security that prevented vandalism, the minimum upkeep required to keep her from sinking at the pier. Any restoration or conversion project would cost hundreds of millions more. And the asbestos that Gibbs had used throughout the ship, standard practice in 1952, a hazardous nightmare in the 21st century, would have to be completely removed before any public use was possible. By 2024, the Conservancy was out of options. The ship's landlord at Pier 82, Penn Warehousing, wanted the dock space back. A rent dispute had escalated into an eviction of a 990-foot ocean liner. And there was nowhere else to take a ship that couldn't sail under her own power and nobody wanted. The SS United States needed a buyer, or she would be scrapped. Susan Gibbs, granddaughter of the man who had dreamed this ship into existence, faced an impossible choice. Let the ship be cut apart for scrap metal, erasing her grandfather's legacy entirely, or find some alternative, any alternative, that would preserve at least part of what the SS United States had meant. That's when Florida came calling. In October 2024, Okaloosa County, Florida, announced that it had purchased the SS United States for $1 million. The plan was not preservation, the plan was transformation. The county, located along the Florida Panhandle, had been building artificial reefs since 1976. They had created 564 reef sites over nearly 50 years, sinking everything from decommissioned ships to concrete structures to create habitats for marine life. The reefs attracted fish, which attracted fishermen, which attracted tourists, which drove the local economy. The SS United States, at 990 feet long, would become the largest artificial reef in the world. She would be sunk approximately 22 nautical miles south of Destin Fort Walton Beach in about 180 feet of water. The upper deck would sit just 55 to 60 feet below the surface, accessible to novice divers, while the deeper sections would offer challenges for more experienced explorers. The total project budget was $10.1 million, covering the purchase price, towing operations, environmental remediation, and contributions toward a land-based museum. Pensacola contributed $1.5 million. The Coastal Conservation Association of Florida added $500,000. The economic projections showed the reef generating over $3 million per year in diving tourism alone. For the Conservancy, it was a bittersweet resolution. Susan Gibbs publicly supported the plan, noting that reefing was vastly preferable to scrapping. The ship's funnels, radar mast, and salvaged artifacts would become the centerpiece of a museum on land, partnering with Think Design, the firm behind the 9/11 Memorial Museum and the Empire State Building Observatory. The story of the SS United States would be preserved, even if the ship herself would not. But not everyone agreed. On March 2, 2025, a group calling itself the New York Coalition to Save the SS United States filed a federal lawsuit attempting to block the sinking. The coalition argued that Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act required a public hearing before any historic property could be destroyed. They proposed an alternative: bring the ship to New York, display her at the Gowanus Bay Terminal in Brooklyn. John Quadrozzi Jr., the terminal's owner, offered to host the vessel while a longer-term solution could be developed. The lawsuit was dismissed in August 2025, but the opposition continued. On December 18, 2025, the New York City Council unanimously passed Resolution 0649, sponsored by Council member Gail Brewer, calling on the federal government to prevent the sinking. James S. Kaplan of the Lower Manhattan Historical Association called the potential loss incalculable. Environmental concerns were raised as well. The aluminum superstructure and steel hull, critics noted, would interact electrochemically in seawater, a process called galvanic corrosion. The SS Andrea Doria, an Italian liner that sank after a collision in 1956, had collapsed in just 17 years due to similar corrosion. How long would the SS United States last as a reef? Okaloosa County officials responded that their program had nearly 50 years of experience with artificial reefs, that the ship would be properly prepared, and that the alternative, scrapping, would destroy the vessel entirely. At least as a reef, she would serve a new purpose. The debate continued even as the preparations moved forward. Getting the SS United States from Philadelphia to Mobile, Alabama, proved more complicated than anyone anticipated. The initial departure was scheduled for mid-November 2024. Weather in the Gulf of Mexico forced a delay. A week later, the U.S. Coast Guard issued a captain of the port order stating that the ship may not have suitable stability for the intended transit and presents a hazardous condition to the port and waterway. Inspectors had found a potentially compromised tank and a large amount of oily residue present. Because the ship didn't move by December 14, 2024, Okaloosa County was required to pay a $100,000 penalty to the pier operator. A February 8, 2025, move was canceled at the Coast Guard's request. On February 14th, the ship was shifted from Pier 82 to Pier 80, a move that could only be accomplished at high tide because of silt accumulation around the hull. Another departure scheduled for February 17th was canceled due to severe weather. Finally, on February 19, 2025, the SS United States began her final voyage. Tugboats maneuvered the 990-foot vessel into the Delaware River around noon. Bridges were closed to traffic as she passed beneath them, not just for safety, but to prevent motorists from stopping on the highway to photograph the spectacle. Thousands tracked her progress online as she moved down the East Coast, through the Atlantic, into the Gulf of Mexico, and finally to Mobile. The journey took approximately 2 weeks. When she arrived, the real work began. The Port of Mobile, August 2025. Workers in protective gear are systematically dismantling what remains of the ship's interior. Everything that cannot go into the water must come out. The asbestos that Gibbs used for fireproofing, state-of-the-art in 1952, a toxic liability 70 years later. The lead paint, the wiring, the glass and plastic and rubber, the fuel residue. Every material that might harm marine life or violate environmental regulations must be identified, cataloged, and removed. The funnels came down in early August. Those massive red, white, and blue stacks that were once visible from miles away on the open ocean. They'll be transported to the future museum site, where they'll stand as monuments to what the ship once was. The radar mast followed, along with one of the propellers. The archived materials, photographs, documents, passenger manifests, artifacts, have been secured for eventual display. By December 2025, the Conservancy reported that remediation was 80% complete. The tentative timeline calls for deployment in March 2026. The method will be controlled flooding, no explosives. Holes will be cut in the hull and deck. Pumps will fill the interior with water over a period of hours, and the ship will slowly settle to the bottom. Okaloosa County is developing plans to make the sinking viewable, either virtually or in person via media coverage. After decades of failed preservation efforts, the final chapter of the SS United States will be witnessed by anyone who wants to watch. When the SS United States finally reaches her resting place on the floor of the Gulf of Mexico, she will be larger than any artificial reef in history. Longer than the Titanic by over 100 feet. A habitat for grouper and snapper and amberjack, for the coral that will slowly colonize her hull, for the divers who will explore her passageways in the decades to come. Her funnels will stand on land, towering over visitors to the museum that Susan Gibbs and the Conservancy have worked to create. The radar mast, the propeller, the salvaged fixtures and archived photographs. The story of William Francis Gibbs and his 40-year quest. The Blue Ribbon record that has stood for 73 years and will likely stand forever because no one builds passenger liners for speed anymore. The records themselves, the passenger manifests, the crew lists, the documentation of over 1 million transatlantic travelers are preserved at the Ellis Island Family History Center. You can search them online. You can find the name of that celebrity who sailed in 1955, or the immigrant who took tourist class in 1962, or the Rhodes Scholar who crossed in 1968 on his way to Oxford. What would William Francis Gibbs think of all this? He died on September 6, 1967, at the age of 81, just 2 weeks after his birthday. The SS United States was still sailing then, still the pride of the American merchant marine, still the fastest ship in the world. He never saw her retirement, never witnessed the decades of decay, never imagined that his masterpiece would end up rusting at a pier in Philadelphia, while one rescue plan after another fell through. The day after he died, the SS United States passed his Lower Manhattan office on her way out of New York Harbor. Her whistle sounded a long, mournful salute, a farewell from the ship to the man who had dreamed her into existence. He built her to be unsinkable, fireproof, the safest ocean liner ever constructed, and now, in the final irony, she will be deliberately sunk. These are the unanswered questions. Why sink instead of preserve? The answer is economics. Cold and simple. After 55 years of failed plans, the floating condominiums, the hospital ship conversion, the hotel proposals, the Crystal Cruises partnership, the RXR realty discussions, no one found a way to make the numbers work. The maintenance costs alone exceeded $3 million per year. A full restoration would have cost hundreds of millions. The asbestos remediation alone was a project of staggering complexity. The ship that William Francis Gibbs had designed to last forever turned out to be too expensive to keep. Could she have been saved? Perhaps. With unlimited money, with a benefactor willing to absorb losses indefinitely, with a stroke of political will that never materialized, the New York Coalition tried. The City Council passed its resolution. James Kaplan and the Lower Manhattan Historical Association made their case eloquently and passionately. None of it changed the fundamental reality. Preserving a 990-foot ocean liner requires resources that no private organization possessed and no government was willing to provide. The Queen Mary survives in Long Beach, California, but she required decades of public subsidy and even now faces an uncertain future. The SS Rotterdam survived in the Netherlands through creative financing and Dutch determination. The SS United States, despite her superior engineering and historic significance, could not find equivalent support. Will the reef last? The galvanic corrosion question remains open. The aluminum superstructure and steel hull will interact electrochemically in seawater, slowly dissolving the bonds between them. The SS Andrea Doria, an Italian liner that sank after a collision in 1956, collapsed in just 17 years due to similar corrosion. Her grand staircase fell in on itself, her decks pancaked, her identity as a ship disappeared into an unrecognizable mass of debris. But Okaloosa County has built 564 reefs over nearly 50 years, and their marine biologists believe the SS United States, properly prepared, will endure far longer. The aluminum will be largely removed during remediation. The steel hull, treated and monitored, should provide habitat for decades. Whether divers a century from now will recognize her as a ship or merely as an unusually large artificial structure remains to be seen. What happens to the speed record? It remains unbroken, and it will almost certainly stand forever. No shipping company builds passenger liners for speed anymore. The economics of cruise ships favor size and amenities over velocity. A modern cruise ship carries thousands more passengers than the SS United States ever did, offers dozens of restaurants and swimming pools and entertainment venues, and travels at a leisurely 18 knots because nobody is in a hurry to get anywhere. The age of the ocean greyhound is over. What would William Francis Gibbs think? He died believing that his ship would sail forever. In 1967, the SS United States was still crossing the Atlantic, still breaking no records because she had already broken them all, still carrying passengers in the style that Gibbs had envisioned. He never saw the jets win. He never saw the ship laid up and stripped and sold and abandoned. He never imagined that his masterpiece would spend half a century rusting at a pier, while planners and developers and dreamers tried and failed to find her a purpose. He designed her to be unsinkable, compartmentalized against flooding, fireproofed against disaster, built with the redundancies that a Navy contract demanded. He designed her to survive anything the ocean could throw at her. He didn't design her to survive the economics of a world that had moved on. The SS United States was the last of her kind. The fastest, the safest, the most technically advanced liner America ever produced. She carried presidents and movie stars and 1 million ordinary passengers across the Atlantic during 17 years of glory. She survived 55 years of abandonment, neglect, and false hope. Now she will sink, deliberately, carefully, under the watchful eyes of engineers who studied the specifications that William Francis Gibbs kept secret for so long. The water will rise around her hull. The galleries where passengers once dined will fill with the warm waters of the Gulf. The observation lounge, the theater, the staterooms where celebrities slept and deals were struck and romances bloomed. All of it will become habitat for a different kind of life. Fish will swim through spaces where orchestras once played. Coral will grow on surfaces where hands once traced the aluminum railings. The fastest ship ever built will become the slowest thing in the ocean. A reef, immobile, permanent, home to creatures that know nothing of blue ribbons, or Cold War secrets, or the dreams of a Philadelphia boy who saw a ship launch and never looked away. And somewhere on the surface, if the timing is right, you might see her funnels one last time, red, white, and blue, disappearing beneath the waves. The fastest ship ever built, sinking on purpose. At last.